yeah, I can try and make them more palatable, but sometimes they're going to be less funny because of it. You know, I think you often have to lean in with comedy. If you water down what you want to say, then very rarely do you get someone who wasn't going to laugh start laughing, and then the people who were going to laugh, they might laugh less because you've diluted it.
Hello and welcome to Freelance Pod. My name's Suchandrika and I'll be your host. So in this episode, we welcome writer and comedian Alex Bertulis-Fernandes. Alex has been a stand-up comedian for the past year, and she's also writing a memoir. She's on the Penguin Right Now scheme, an award-winning programme that places new writers from underrepresented backgrounds with mentors and provides workshops and other forms of support over 1 year. The scheme is closed for applications this year, I should know because I got my rejection a few weeks ago, but there's always next year. Joking aside, in light of the first in-depth academic study into diversity in UK publishing, which came out a couple of weeks ago, one of the many issues that they found was that publishers still see writers of colour as a quote-unquote commercial risk. So schemes like Right Now are incredibly important, and there will be links to both the scheme and the report in the show notes. I urge you to please check them out. So Alex and I first met a few months ago at the then new Clean Prose, a co-working space for writers in Shoreditch, East London, where we both attended a memoir writing workshop with writer Cathy Rensett-Brink. Sadly, due to the pressures of lockdown, Clean Prose is actually shut down now on the 29th of May, and we're very sad to see it go. Alex and I started the conversation you're about to hear her side of, you should be used to that by now, by talking about the time she went viral on Twitter. There's a link in the show notes so you can see it for yourself and enjoy it for yourself. I think it's a very funny tweet. It involves a piece of art that she made in class in response to her teacher telling her, incredibly, to dial down the feminism. Can you hear my very sarcastic quotation marks there? So here's what Alex had to say in response, and she also goes through how important Twitter is to being a comedian and how writing stand-up has influenced writing her memoir. So let's see what Alex has to say.
So I think it was back in 2018, one of my art teachers suggested that I dial down the feminism. And I kind of, I was like really kind of bemused by this, just because I didn't really even know what that would look like. So I decided to kind of try and imagine, like, if there were a feminist style, like, what would it look like? And it made me think about this quotation from this musician, I think it's Kathleen Hanna. And she talks about, like, you know, how she'd rather be kind of annoying feminist girl than, like, be complicit in her own dehumanization. So I kind of mocked up what I thought the DAO would look like. And I posted it on Twitter, and at this point I had like maybe 400 followers. I didn't use any hashtags or anything. I just put it out online because you're told as an artist, quote unquote artist, that's like what you're meant to do. But with it blew up really quickly, and I like it has, I think it has almost 100,000 retweets. I don't know how many likes it has. That's the kind of thing we should know. But it just kind of, I got a lot of attention on the internet overnight that I had not experienced before. And that was really interesting and fascinating and scary. And also completely unique in my career. Certainly, I've not gone viral before since, despite my best efforts. It was really amazing for me to see how many people hated me just for using the word feminist, and also how many people assumed they knew exactly the kind of person I was. Like there'd be, and I should say, although there was some criticism from women, the vast majority was from men, and there'd be stuff like, oh, she just needs to get laid, or like, and I actually use one of these lines in my stand-up routine where someone asked me, you know, what's it like to be a 24/7 raving bitch. And it was very strange, but also I've never considered myself a particularly thick-skinned person. So if you told me beforehand, you're gonna get a lot of vitriol online, I would probably maybe not have posted it, which is not, I know that's not what everyone wants to hear from someone who's posted a quote-unquote sassy feminist piece. They want to hear that you'd have done anything. But I was quite sensitive and vulnerable. And if I'd known, I maybe wouldn't have posted it. But what surprised me was that actually when I did receive all that attention and with it, some of the hate, it actually didn't bother me in the way I thought it would. I do think when the attacks came from women, I was slightly more put out and felt slightly more, what does this say about me? But on the whole, I genuinely found it funny, which is not something I would have anticipated. I had men emailing me what they thought the dial should look like. And I had, I think there was a debate on Reddit about whether it was actually a dial or a switch. Lots of men saying, I don't know how dials work. A lot of men explaining my artwork back to me. And yeah, I had an email from a guy saying, you may, I'm sure I've emailed you before, which to me was just like, you've not emailed me before, which just shows kind of how mindless and frequent your attacks on women on the internet are. You can't even keep track of whether you've attacked me before. And he was just saying, what am I meant to tell my daughters, that they're not allowed to, look after the house, and I was just and then also what terrified me was that this man had daughters. If he's attacking random women on the internet for calling themselves a feminist, but internet, not always the most fun place to be. Most of my social media following, and I find that I really hate using that phrase because that makes it sound like they're all sitting in a room waiting for me to tweet. Most of them come from my art and from the dial down the feminism stuff. And often every time I tweet about anything that isn't feminism, I lose a follower. But also, it was interesting because I had most of my Instagram followers, again, came from dial down the feminism. And I found that a lot of the people who followed me on that Instagram account were looking for art. And then whenever I posted a comedy thing, the followers would go down. And I thought, fair enough. If you're here for feminist art, you might not want to watch my stand-up. And especially not even watch my stand-up, you might not want to see posters advertising me doing a gig that, is in a country you don't even live in. So I made a decision to set up a separate comedy account, Instagram account. And that was a tricky decision just because I had to kind of work on building an audience from scratch there. And I still have so much to do because the followers I have on my comedy account are nothing compared to the followers I have on my art account, which I should say now is still a very humble amount, so it has been interesting seeing that, and you might think, oh, someone being interested in one area of your art would translate to them being interested into other areas, but that's not always the case. And I've also found it difficult from, when I'm applying for jobs, I very much want to, present myself as capable and reliable. And I do think I am those things. But if I'm posting videos, where I talk about my depression, people don't often think, oh, depression equals reliable. And also, I might make, during my stand-up, I might make jokes about race or making white people uncomfortable. And I do worry that employers will think, oh, we can't hire her because we'll be in a room and she'll just be really provocative and wanting to talk about race. And, if anything, in comedy, if anything, you get better at reading rooms. I'm not going to go into your work meeting and call out, your lack of diversity. So it's this, there is this conflict between, wanting to put myself out there, but also wanting to people to know that that's one area of my life, and that it's not, so like, for instance, one of the jokes I make is that I'm mixed race, which means I'm brown enough to meet your diversity quota and white enough to never call you out on it. And, in the creative industries, it is very white. And I am used to often being one of the only brown people in the room. I think, it's better in London, but I've definitely gone into workshops and spaces where I'm the only brown person. And also, I think people don't realize how aware we are of that. And, and I have this conflict because I've had a very anglicized upbringing. My dad's Indian, but a lot of people wouldn't know that. And certainly the way I've lived my life, it doesn't feel very close to my dad's experiences in India. But we notice these things. So, yeah, my comedy will highlight what I notice, but it doesn't mean I'm going to let that affect my professionalism. I very rarely tweet jokes, partly because I really like being able to control or have more control over, how a joke's received, when I perform it. Obviously, it's very hard to convey tone on Twitter. Having said that, there are, comedians in America that I follow on Twitter who, I've never seen live and I'm unlikely to see live, but I love the jokes they tweet, and I love the clips I've seen of them performing. And I think I think if you do want to do writing and comedy writing, it is a really great way to get noticed, but it's not what I'm currently doing. And I guess I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I want out of a career and the best way to get there. I think comedians have to be very on it online, and especially to a degree. And I should say this, I am not as on it as I should be, by any means. And a lot of comedy does seem to be about having a platform and building a following, so that if you do eventually tour, people will want to see you. People who haven't seen you live will, see you've built your career online and watch your content online and want to engage with you. So basically, I think it's very important that comedians do that. Having said that, I'm not very good at it. And I'm beginning, I've actually started doing some paid work for other comedians, helping them do that. But I don't necessarily follow those principles in my own work, which I know is very bad. But it can just be very difficult, especially when you're at the level I'm at, where I've not got, I wouldn't even say I necessarily. I've got followers on social media, but I don't think I have a following that's waiting for me to gig in a certain city. In fact, I know I don't. And it can be very hard because you just feel like you're kind of shouting into the void. I might post, oh, I've got a gig in Leicester, but apart from maybe 2 friends in Leicester and all the other comedians who live in Leicester, most people don't care. And I think it's about becoming comfortable enough with putting yourself out there, knowing that you're shouting into the void, and knowing that most people don't care, and trusting that eventually they will care. And it's just about having the energy to invest in that. And I think especially in my first year, I think I've mainly focused on gigging and trying to improve my technique and my writing and not worrying so much about that. But I think as you progress, I think that's very important from what I can see. Stand-up's definitely changed the way I write, for better and for worse. So one good thing is that you get used to writing so often and editing your material so often, depending on how the audience reacts to it. But, when it comes to my book, I've definitely been like, oh, I need to get to what I'm trying to say quicker, because I imagine saying on stage and I think, do I need half of that? Because I know the audience would get bored, which means the reader might get bored. But also, it is hard with the books, with when I've been writing my book, to realize that it's still allowed to have elements of sadness, and there are allowed to be lines which aren't funny. And I find even with the kind of content I've consumed and the TV programs I've watched since starting stand-up, I find it a lot harder to watch shows which don't have jokes in them. My instinct is always, what would make this better? Jokes. So although I think it's improved my writing in some senses, I've had to really force myself to be okay with the fact that, not everything's going to be funny. Not everything's a setup to a punchline, especially because some of the writing in my book is about my life. Although I try and put humor in where I can, it's not all, it's not all fun. And, I think it's about trusting that the reader will be willing to stick with the sadder parts to get to the funnier parts. And although in Edinburgh shows, there's very much that theme of, this is the struggle, and there's a lot more room for darkness and sadness, I think, in Edinburgh shows, in kind of your regular 5-10 minute spot, because I'm still at the stage where that's the amount of stage time I'm usually having. I think if you've got 5 or 10 minutes and you talk about depression and mental health as much as I do, there's a real fear that the audience will feel sorry for you. And I'm never looking for that. I'm never looking for sympathy. If I can't make someone laugh, then the most I want from them is empathy. And to be honest, I like the idea of someone in that room who's maybe struggled to get out of the house that morning due to depression, to sit in that room and feel like, oh, I'm not the only one, and she's here and she's able to talk about these things, and people are on board. But it's also challenging when you've only got a short amount of time, when you're not doing an hour-long show. You don't want to. You don't have as much time to earn the audience's trust and tell them I am okay. For me, the fact that I'm on stage should be a sign, for me at least, that I am okay. Because if I wasn't okay enough to do that, I would be in bed. I suppose it's tricky because, with a book or with an hour-long show, you can hold the reader's hand the whole way through and show them all the different complexities and talk about, oh, this was a high point, this was a low point, this is why I'm still here. But in 5-10 minutes, you can't. It's much more difficult to even attempt that journey. And also, I'm also very aware that I don't want to bring the mood down. I do want people to laugh, and I also don't want to make it too difficult for an act following me. And that's why I'm really grateful to MCs, because if I have, even if I made people laugh, if I have brought the mood down a bit, it's really wonderful to have an MC kind of come on afterwards and get the energy back up and kind of reset the room ready for the next act. When I write my set, and especially, now I'm getting longer sets, I definitely pay more attention to, is all the depression stuff in one section? Because on one hand, that might make sense structurally, because it might flow better. But also I'm much more aware of how the audience is likely to be feeling. So I try and contrast it with more moments of lightness. And if there are moments where I'm worried that the audience is seeing me as a victim, then the next bit of material, I'll try and put myself in a more kind of high power or a higher position. What's it called? A higher status kind of role. So, but it's also been finding a balance between, like, I do have a dark sense of humor. That's been a way I have coped with things, and that's not everyone's cup of tea. And I'm very aware that there are some jokes I make that are just going to be sad to some people, and I can't. But I can try and make them more palatable, but sometimes they're going to be less funny because of it. I think you often have to lean in with comedy. If you water down what you want to say, then very rarely do you get someone who wasn't going to start laughing. And then the people who were going to laugh, they might laugh less because you've diluted it. So on one hand, it's been interesting because on one hand, I've become more aware of how the audience is going to react, especially from experience. And I even now have jokes for if a joke doesn't land. So that's not to say I'll never. I try to avoid saying, you'll find that funny an hour later. That I don't really like those kind of jokes where it's, it's on the audience for not finding it funny, or you'll figure that one out later. But I do have jokes where, so if I have a joke about race and it doesn't land very well, then I might follow up with a joke about making white people uncomfortable. And so I've had more of a sense from experience of how to play the room. I'm still very much learning. I'm definitely not an expert in this by any means. And I still consider myself a writer more than a performer, and get told I often get praised for my writing rather than my performing, which, whilst lovely, is difficult when it's a performance-based art. Whilst I do have this awareness now that I'm still honing, I've also accepted that I'm just, there are going to be some jokes that don't land for certain people. And if I think if you try and be all things to everyone, you'll end up being nothing to anyone. So my first time at Clean Prose was for Kathy Rensenbrink's memoir writing masterclass. And it was just a really brilliant workshop, and I remember feeling really welcome and really sort of in awe of the space. It was a beautiful space, and I just remember thinking, I want to write here all the time. And I was quite fortunate because Clean Prose had partnered with the Penguin Right Now scheme, which I'm currently on, which aims to publish more works and encourage writing from those underrepresented in the publishing industry. So as part of that, I'd been offered some free days to use the space. And, that was amazing, especially because at that time I was unemployed, so I couldn't afford membership at that point. And I remember coming along for one of my free days and just loving having that space to write. The top floor was completely silent and soundproofed even. And I just remember going up there and sitting in the little booth and feeling like, oh, this is, I have no excuses not to write here. I'm literally in the perfect environment for me. I didn't even connect to the Wi-Fi. And around that time, I was, looking at the Clean Prose website, and I saw they were advertising for a community coordinator. And in the end, they ended up offering 2 people that role, and I was one of the people. And I worked there from February until May, when sadly Clean Prose had to make the decision to close permanently. So I got 3 top tips for writers. Number 1, write as often as possible. From my own personal experience, the main difficulties I've had with writing have been not writing. And I think if you let yourself write, you can worry about stuff like editing and whether it's any good and all those things later. For me, I think that's a separate process to the act of writing. So I'd say my next top tip, I don't think I've ever used the phrase top tip in my life, is from Anne Lamott. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But it's basically, you own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. I think my third tip is to try not to be afraid to be vulnerable. Just because I find that a lot of the good stuff in my life has come from being vulnerable. And just I feel the connections I've made with people have been better when I've been vulnerable, because I feel like when you're vulnerable, other people are more willing to be vulnerable around you. I have throughout my life got in my own way and been afraid to put myself out there and put my work out there for fear that it's not good enough. But most of the times when I've done that, I've not regretted it. So yeah, I think know what you're willing to be vulnerable about and do it.
Thanks, Alex, for her great advice and for speaking to me for this episode. You can find links to her social media accounts in the show notes. And thank you for listening to Freelance Pod. If you enjoy the show, please do rate, review, subscribe, tell a friend, tie a note to a pigeon, yell it at the moon, yell it at the sun, why not? And just generally share the word. Thanks again, speak soon, bye.